Hello, here is my math teaching project, task 4. So for the first part of this project, planning for instruction and assessment, the problem that I identified was that for this section, I was asked to describe and justify how my instructional strategies and plan supports would be appropriate for students with the following learning needs. First, students labeled as underperformers. Second, students who are struggling readers. And third, students who are learning language as a second language, also known as ELLs. I responded to this question with that my lesson would include lots of time for group work, so that students who do have a good understanding of what's going on and what's being taught can help students who are struggling, or also students who are English language learners. Both of these types of students would benefit from group work. The second thing I said was that I would provide laminated circles to use as manipulatives throughout the lesson. This might be helpful for students with ADHD and also students who are learning English as a second language, because they may benefit from having a physical manipulative to use rather than just verbal directions and verbal strategies to use. I also said that students could be provided with the option to sit and work independently to help with focus. Sometimes students with ADHD, this can be more beneficial for them during instruction. And then lastly, I said that there would be a lot of opportunities for whole group discussion about the context and vocabulary. So the purpose of this would just to be making sure that all students have that same background knowledge when they're going into a lesson. While this answer may have been based on things that I've read before and just knowledge that I've accumulated throughout my time in the MAT program, I did not specifically link these strategies to readings I've done regarding strategies for supporting students with diverse learning needs. So I didn't include specific references to that research-based strategy. Here is my proof of the problem. As you can see in this section of the project, Ms. Hollis Gordon gave me feedback. She said, good, for the actual EdTPA, I encourage you to link your strategies to readings that you've done regarding strategies to support students with diverse learning needs. So my plan for addressing this problem in the project is that when I'm working on the EdTPA, I am going to review articles and chapters read, as well as notes I've taken throughout the MAT program. As this course comes to an end, something that I've been trying to really do is organize all of the notes I've taken, download and save all of the articles that we have on Moodle, and just also making sure I know where the Van de Waal text is. That way these can all be references to me when I'm working on the EdTPA and just also in my instruction in general. That way I can use these and I can prove how my strategies that I'm taking are research-based. So when I'm working on the EdTPA specifically, I will reference those articles and those chapters when necessary to prove that my strategies are research-based and not just providing strategies without any links to actual articles or chapters about that. When implementing the lesson, the problem that I identified was that when considering how to deepen student learning during instruction, I wish that I had been better about asking why and how do you know questions in response to student answers. My problem was that I tended to just say, good job, or move on to the next thing if a student got the answer right and not really spend much time on that. The answer to these questions, like why and how do you know, can be very reflective of students' conceptual understanding or the lack thereof. Additionally, by developing an answer to these questions, students can deepen their conceptual understanding, because as they're having to explain why, they have to think about why is this the answer? How did I get to this? And so just that practice of thinking through that can develop their conceptual understanding of a certain topic or problem. My proof here, you can see that Dr. Wilson said another way that you could elicit students' math reasoning is by asking them why and how did you know questions. So that's something I plan to do in the future. Speaking of my plan, specifically when teaching in the future, I will practice why and how do you know questions in response to students' answers, rather than just saying good job or moving on if they get it correct. A big thing for me is just making an intentional effort to slow down and allow time in my lesson for these responses. So when considering how long the lesson is going to take, I'm going to keep that in mind, that these responses will probably take a little bit longer. It is going to involve slowing down and not just kind of moving through everything at a quick pace. Additionally, I will be prepared for students not to be able to answer these questions. So students might not have that conceptual understanding. They might not know why. So when students aren't able to give that conceptual understanding answer, I will be prepared for that. And with my conceptual understanding, I will help them understand why that is the answer, or how they can know that that's the answer, which again is going to require more time in the lesson for that, but it's a beneficial part of the lesson. So it's something that I definitely want to do in the future. When assessing student learning, the problem that I identified was that when explaining how feedback provided to the two focus students address their individual strengths and needs relative to the learning objectives measured, I explained how the students shared their work and I explained my response. However, I did not explain how my feedback addressed the students' individual strengths and their needs relative to the learning objective. As you can see, for proof of the problem, here is a screenshot of the feedback I received. You can see after my answer that Ms. Halls-Gordon or Dr. Wilson said, your response explains how students shared their work and your response. For the actual EdTPA, please remember that this question is asking you to explain how your feedback addressed the students' individual needs and their strengths relative to the learning objectives. So this problem was partially because I didn't read the question carefully enough, but also because I don't think I took the time to do this during my lesson specifically. So my plan for this is that when interacting with students, I am going to spend more thought considering the students' strengths and weaknesses and how my response to their sharing can address them specifically. So in my lesson, I tended to just go kind of quickly and respond to students on sort of a surface level. But in the future instruction, and especially with EdTPA, reading these questions, when students are sharing, I want to think about who is this student, what are their strengths, and what are their needs relative to what we're learning about today, and how can the answer that I give them address these specifically. So that just takes some more intentional thought and slowing down and just sort of thinking about each student on an individual basis when they're providing their answers. So what does teaching math conceptually mean to me? First, teaching math conceptually means that you're teaching students concepts in a way that leads them to be able to explain the why behind their reasoning for taking certain steps when solving a problem. So asking those why and how do you know that's to answer questions that we talked about, and just being able to set them up for success in answering those questions. Students who have a conceptual understanding of a math concept can explain why the answer is correct and not just how they reached it. So they have more than just that procedural understanding where they can tell you, I took step 1, 2, 3, and this is the answer. They can explain why step 1, 2, 3 led to the answer. Teaching conceptually revolves around teaching big ideas, and there's less time on memorization. So it's just teaching those bigger concepts, and just less time on like doing things like drills and worksheets that aren't going to give that conceptual understanding and will just focus on procedures instead. I've learned that teaching math conceptually takes more time, effort, and energy, which is why I think a lot of teachers don't do it. It just takes time. You have to have the effort and put in the time and effort to make sure that you understand it conceptually in order to be able to teach it. And it also can just be more confusing and take longer for students to get that conceptual understanding than they might with a procedural understanding. Conceptual understanding allows students to apply their knowledge to different problems. So for example, if students have a conceptual understanding of multiplication when working with multiplication tables, most likely that they'll get a quicker understanding when you move on to word problems and algebra because they understand multiplication on a conceptual level and not just the procedure to solving multiplication problems. So you can take that concept and apply it to multiple different problems and it'll just come to them a lot quicker. Lastly, teaching math conceptually involves giving students time to explore problems and find answers in their own ways. So rather than just providing them with the standard algorithm and saying, this is how you do it, just do it this way every time. If you give students that time to kind of explore the problem, take different strategies that make sense to them to getting the answer, they'll be more likely to have a conceptual understanding of that sort of mathematical topic. Whereas if you just give them the standard algorithm, they just plug in the numbers and do that every time, and they're not going to really understand why that's getting them the answer or how they ended up with the answer that they're getting. Whereas if they figure it out themselves, they'll be able to explain that better.